An old photograph changed everything we knew about Billy the Kid. In it, the young outlaw appears playing croquet, a scene that contrasts with the image of a ruthless gunslinger. But is this photo authentic? Discover the mystery, the evidence, and the controversies surrounding one of the most enigmatic images of the Wild West. Imagine an old photograph, faded by time. In it, a group of men from the Old West seem to be enjoying something unexpected, a game of croquet. But at the center of the image, one face stands out. A young man in a hat with a steady gaze and calm posture, said to be Billy the Kid. The question is this photo real? Could it have survived more than a century, hidden in some forgotten chest, only to reveal the most legendary outlaw in American history at his most human moment? The story begins in 2010, when a collector named Randy Guajaro bought a box of old photographs for just $2 at a pawn shop. Among them, a peculiar image. 4 men, a few women, and a rustic countryside scene. Nothing stood out much until Guajaro noticed a detail. That skinny young man, holding a croquet mallet. He looked remarkably like Billy the Kid, who, according to official records, died in 1881, shot by Sheriff Pat Garrett. The discovery sent shockwaves through historians and collectors. For years, experts tried to confirm whether it was truly Billy's face. Facial comparisons, clothing studies, even light and shadow analyses were used to determine authenticity. The location was also investigated, believed to be a ranch in New Mexico owned by one of Billy's companions, the famous Charlie Boder, a member of the Regulators group. But why is this photo so important? Because to this day, only one confirmed image of Billy the Kid exists, taken in Fort Sumner in 1879. In it, he appears with a cold expression, holding a Winchester rifle and a Colt revolver. The perfect image of the outlaw the myth turned into a legend. If the croquet photo is real, it shows another side. The man behind the fame, a regular boy laughing with friends, far from the feared gunslinger. And that's where the mystery deepens. Who took the photo? Why was it forgotten for so long? And most importantly, what was Billy the Kid doing playing croquet? A pastime typical of the Victorian elite, so far removed from the brutal world of cowboys and outlaws. To understand the importance of this photograph, we must go back to New Mexico in 1878, a territory in turmoil. It was a time marked by bloody struggles for power and influence, the peak of the so-called Lincoln County War. Merchants, ranchers, and politicians fought for control over trade routes and land, and in the midst of this chaos emerged the young Henry McCarty, later known as Billy the Kid. Likely born in New York and orphaned early, Billy grew up on the streets of the West in a life of escapes, petty crimes, and dangerous alliances. When the local Civil War erupted, he joined the Regulators, a group of armed men defending one side of the conflict. It was a time when loyalty and betrayal blurred, and Billy's name spread through every saloon, every newspaper in the territory. Some called him a hero, a fearless youth who stood up to the corrupt and the powerful. Others saw him as a cold killer, an unpredictable gunslinger with a defiant grin and a quick trigger. But amid all the myth-building, what few remember is that Billy the Kid was also human, and it's precisely that humanity the croquet photo seems to reveal. If the image really shows him alongside his fellow Regulators, it would have been taken shortly after the Battle of Blazers Mill, a clash that left casualties on both sides and marked the beginning of the war's end. Those men, exhausted and fleeing the authorities, may have found a rare moment of rest on some remote ranch. Playing croquet, a calm and elegant game, almost sounds ironic given the violence that surrounded them. But maybe that's exactly what they sought, a moment of normalcy amid chaos. A reminder they were still young, trying to find some meaning in a life of guns and pursuit. Studies on the photograph suggest the location is likely Boder's Ranch near Chaves County. The background structures, the clothing styles, even the vegetation match historical records of the era. The young man identified as Billy appears to wear a characteristic hat tilted to the side and a simple jacket consistent with New Mexico fashion and weather in the 1870s. The face, when compared to the only confirmed image of Billy, reveals subtle similarities. The shape of the chin, slightly drooping eyes, and the enigmatic smile. However, what truly intrigues scholars is the context of the photo. Croquet was a game brought from the eastern United States and popular among wealthy families with refined customs. In the West, it was extremely rare. The presence of mallets, balls, and iron hoops raises questions. Where did they come from? Who brought them to that ranch? Some theorists believe the regulators were being sheltered by wealthy sympathizers, perhaps merchants or politicians who opposed the Lincoln County rivals. Others claim the game might have been a form of satire, an improvised pastime with adapted materials merely to pass the time. A technical analysis conducted in 2015 by expert Kent Gibson pointed to a very high probability of authenticity. He used facial recognition and three-dimensional comparisons, as well as confirming geographic and historical consistency. The result was shocking. There was over a 90% chance that the man in the photo was indeed Billy the Kid. Still, the academic community remained divided. Some historians insist it's impossible to confirm without absolute certainty, as the only official photo is a worn tintype. Others argue that the symbolic value of the discovery surpasses the need for total proof, because even if the image is just a representation, it touches on something deeper, the collective memory of who Billy really was. The myth of Billy the Kid grew because the public needed him. At the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, the United States was looking for heroes who symbolized the courage and rebelliousness of a growing country. Billy, with his youthful face and reputation as an untamed gunslinger, fit the role perfectly. But behind the bullets and escapes was a boy who knew how to play the guitar, who danced at Mexican parties, and who was loved by many families in New Mexico. He spoke Spanish fluently and was treated as part of the community. This photo, if real, reinforces precisely that human side. The boy laughing among friends, the outlaw who still believed, perhaps, that he could live free. When the photo emerged, newspapers and television programs rushed to call it the Holy Grail of the Old West. Estimates suggested its value could reach $5 million. The collector who bought it for only $2 million became sought after by museums and millionaires. But the real issue wasn't the price. It was what the image represented. Because in that aged piece of metal, the public saw something more than a historical curiosity. They saw the possibility that Billy the Kid wasn't just a bloody legend, but someone who lived ordinary, perhaps happy, moments before fate pushed him toward eternity. Experts in Old West culture know that stories like this feed not only curiosity, but the very essence of the American myth. The Wild West is not just a historical period. It's a narrative of frontiers, dreams, and contradictions. The CROQUET photograph fits into that space between fact and imagination. Even if someday it's proven false, it has already fulfilled its role, making the public question what we really know about Billy. Imagine the scene again. A late afternoon in New Mexico, the sun burning the horizon, laughter echoing across the field as croquet mallets strike worn balls. Billy, with a serene gaze, watches his friends. None of them imagine that, a few months later, many would die. That Billy himself would be hunted like an animal and killed at just 21, supposedly by someone he once called a friend. In that instant, frozen by the photograph, they still believe there would be time. Maybe that's why this image fascinates us so much. It breaks the mold. It shows the most feared outlaw of the West in an act of simplicity, laughing, participating in an innocent game. It's as if the photo says, before the bullet, before the fame, there was a boy who became a symbol of defiance and freedom. But if the photo is real, a new question arises. Who kept it secret for so long? Was it hidden out of fear, by accident, or pure chance? There are reports that the image was passed down through generations in a Western family before being sold in an anonymous lot. Some believe it was kept by someone who knew Billy and wanted to preserve his memory away from newspapers and authorities. Others argue it may have been forgotten because to the one who kept it, it held no importance, just another portrait of times gone by. And perhaps that's where the charm of the story lies. In the Old West, every detail, every object, every photograph carries a layer of mystery. The croquet game, Billy's smile, the ranch in the background. Everything seems to form a narrative parallel to the one we know from books and movies. Not the gunslinger who shoots at sheriffs, but the young man who allows himself a brief rest, surrounded by friends, perhaps believing the worst was already behind him. The photograph may never be confirmed with absolute certainty, but what it evokes is undeniable. It reopens wounds, questions records, and renews the public's fascination with a time when myth and reality blurred with every shot fired and every story told around the fire. And while scholars continue to debate, there is something no one can deny. The look of that young man at the center of the image carries something familiar. A spark, perhaps from someone who knew time would be short, but the legend, eternal. What remains now is to follow the clues, because, hidden among shadows, there is more to this photograph than one might imagine. When news of the supposed photograph of Billy the Kid playing croquet spread, the world of Old West history became divided. On one side, those who saw a historic discovery of immense proportions. On the other, skeptics who saw in the image only a well-interpreted coincidence. But to understand why this photo had such an impact, one must dive into the forces that shaped Billy himself, the man, the myth, and the symbol. After 1881, when Sheriff Pat Garrett announced he had killed Billy the Kid in Fort Sumner, the young outlaw's name ceased to be just that of a hunted bandit. It became a reflection of the very rebellious soul of a nation under construction. The country, witnessing the end of an era of open frontiers and the rise of civilization, found in Billy a final echo of freedom. The boy who defied sheriffs, governors, and death itself became legend. His thin face, defiant smile, and bold gaze all became raw material for poets, writers, filmmakers, and storytellers. It is precisely this imagery that makes the photo so powerful. Because if it does indeed portray Billy, it doesn't show the ruthless gunslinger of the headlines, but a regular young man, perhaps shy, perhaps a dreamer, who existed before the fame. It's as if time allowed a fraction of humanity to slip through the cracks of history. The figure of the Kid has always been shrouded in contradictions. They say he killed 21 men, one for each year of his life. Others claim that number was exaggerated by journalists chasing headlines. He was said to be polite, charismatic, respectful toward women, and loyal to friends. Many Hispanics in New Mexico saw him as a defender of the poor against the corruption of the powerful. That image of a people's avenger was built and reinforced over decades. Writers like Walter Noble Burns and Hollywood screenwriters turned him into a cultural icon. But amid so many versions, little remained of the real Billy. That's why the croquet photograph holds an almost archaeological power. It seems to pierce the veil of legend and bring forth the real man, not the character. Behind the scenes of the authentication process, the effort was exhaustive. Randy Gujaro's team spent months cross-referencing data and analyzing minute details. The wooden shed in the background was compared with still existing ruins in Lincoln County. The vegetation was studied using records from the era, searching for similarities in tree species and land layout. Even the sun's position and the length of the shadows were calculated to determine the time of day. Everything pointed to consistency. And then came the facial examination, a 3D overlay of Billy's known face and the one in the center of the photo. The result was impressive. The contours matched precisely. Still, the most conservative historians remained cautious. The absence of documents or direct testimonies prevents definitive confirmation. The Old West was fertile ground for forgeries and exaggerations. Photographs were expensive, and many portraits of outlaws sold at fairs and in newspapers were staged. But what sets this image apart is the context. It doesn't seem staged. The people in it aren't looking at the camera, not posing, not seeking fame. It's a spontaneous scene of companionship, of ordinary life. That natural quality is what intrigues Old West culture scholars the most. The iconography of outlaws has always been theatrical. Armed men, hardened gazes, imposing outfits. But here, the tone is different. The simplicity of the setting, the croquet game, and the relaxed atmosphere seem to dismantle the gunslinger myth. Perhaps that's why so many are captivated by the image. It suggests that even the most legendary of outlaws had a moment of peace. As the academic debate continued, the story of the photograph captured the interest of the international press. Magazines dedicated to collecting published entire issues analyzing the image. Television programs retraced the path of the regulators, visiting the locations mentioned in the records of the Lincoln County War. Every detail was dissected like a clue in a great historical mystery. But behind the investigation, the public was seeking something deeper, an emotional connection with a character who, more than a century later, still represents the untamed spirit of the West. Billy the Kid, in his lifetime, never imagined he would be remembered. According to reports, he laughed when he heard about the exaggerated stories that surrounded him. He enjoyed dancing, playing the guitar, and attending local parties. On many occasions, he was welcomed by Mexican families who saw him not as a criminal but as a friend. He learned the language, earned Spanish nicknames, and lived among people who treated him like a son. Perhaps it was precisely in these gatherings, in those small moments of companionship, that the memories were formed which the photograph now seems to echo. The croquet game, so out of place in the environment, may symbolize this coexistence. Cultural influence in New Mexico was diverse. Settlers, merchants, soldiers, and immigrants brought habits from different regions. It wouldn't be impossible for a set of mallets and balls to have been brought by a visitor from the East. At that time, the West was beginning to receive novelties brought by the expansion of the railroads. The photograph may be the record of one of these rare cultural intersections, where the wild world met civilization. As researchers progressed, new discoveries emerged. Some local families claimed to own photo albums with faces resembling those of the other men depicted in the scene. There are reports that one of those present was Tom O'Folliard, Billy's friend and companion, killed shortly before the kids' capture. Another could be Charlie Boder, who indeed owned a ranch in the region where the setting seems to have been photographed. If these identifications are true, the historical coherence becomes even stronger. But there is a curious point. No contemporary document mentions such a social gathering involving the regulators. If it happened, it was during an absolutely peaceful interval, far from the eyes of the law. This reinforces the idea that the image is authentic. Only someone close to the group would have access to capture such an intimate scene. And it is this intimacy that unsettles historians. Imagine the photographer, perhaps a friend, perhaps a visitor. He sets up the camera, adjusts the tripod, asks everyone to remain still. The shutter opens for a few seconds, recording on a metal plate a fragment of time that would cross generations. The final click seals a piece of history that no one there believed they were making. Billy, smiling, raises the croquet mallet. A moment of relaxation, perhaps the last photograph taken before his death. This scene not only humanizes the myth, but reopens old wounds of the West. Because Billy's story is also the story of the transition between two worlds, the lawless frontier and the civilization advancing with railroads, fences, and laws. He belonged to the last breath of a time when freedom was absolute but came at a high cost. His rebellion was not just violence, it was resistance in the face of a system that was beginning to impose limits. The modern fascination with this image reflects a collective desire to revisit that time. Museums, collectors, and filmmakers once again turned to the myth of Billy. Scripts, documentaries, and exhibitions began to explore the contrast between the feared outlaw and the young man seen playing croquet. Every detail of the photograph gained new life. The tilt of the hat, the relaxed posture, the way he held the mallet. Everything became a symbol, almost a secret language to decipher who the kid really was. Meanwhile, collector Randy Guajaro faced a dilemma. Between keeping the photo as a personal relic or selling it to a museum, he chose to share its story. He stated that he wasn't seeking fortune, but historical recognition. He said that for him the photo was a bridge between myth and reality, a way to remember that legends also breathed, laughed, and loved. This vision touched the public, and the image ceased to be merely an artifact. It became a living narrative, fueled by every curious gaze that contemplates it. But, as with every story from the Old West, nothing is simple. There are rumors of other photographs, even more enigmatic, that could show Billy in different situations, playing guitar, sitting on a ranch, even riding a horse alongside friends. None have been proven, but each one keeps the flame of mystery alive. What is known is that, over the years, the croquet photograph became a starting point for new investigations. Researchers scoured family archives, farm ruins, and old diaries in search of any mention of that gathering. Amid so many searches, an inevitable feeling arises. We may never know the full truth. Time erases witnesses, destroys evidence, and turns facts into stories. But even without definitive answers, something remains. The image exists. It's there, silent, preserving a moment that escapes logic. And whether by chance or fate, the face of Billy the Kid continues to observe us through it, challenging, once again, time and certainty. And it is at this point that the mystery gains a new layer, because each gaze cast upon that photograph reveals something different, as if Billy himself still had something to tell, something the world has yet to uncover. While the croquet photograph continued to spark debates and heated disputes, a new chapter began to emerge. Museums, collectors, and scholars tried at all costs to reconstruct the image's journey, where it came from, where it passed through, and who might have been the last to keep it before it fell into the hands of Randy Guajaro. This quest became almost a Western-style investigation, with each clue leading to a new question, and each question bringing to light more fragments of Billy the Kid's forgotten history. One of the most curious clues came from an old letter found in a private archive in Texas. The document, dated 1883, mentioned a photograph taken at a ranch near Roswell, showing the young men of Lincoln County in a leisure game. The author of the letter, a local merchant, described the group as Boater's Boys. He didn't mention names, but the time reference coincides with the period when Billy and his companions were hiding after the Lincoln confrontations. The letter reignited the hypothesis that the photo could have been taken during that calm interval between ambushes and escapes. What makes this discovery even more interesting is the name Boater. Charlie Boater was more than an ally. He was one of Billy's closest friends. Married to a Mexican woman named Manuela, Baudry led a relatively stable life before joining the Regulators. There are reports that his ranch was a refuge for the group, where, between pursuits, they would meet to rest. If the photograph was indeed taken there, the context fits perfectly. The croquet game, therefore, may have been a symbol of respite, a momentary truce amidst the undeclared civil war that plagued the territory. Studies conducted using modern 3D mapping techniques compared the ranch terrain to that of the photo. The alignment of the hills, the position of the trees, and the rustic architecture of the barn in the background matched by more than 85%. This kind of coincidence is uncommon in 19th century photographic analyses and reinforces the idea that the setting corresponds to New Mexico. With each new confirmation, the image ceased to be just a curiosity and gained the weight of a historical document. But not everyone was willing to accept this narrative. A group of historians affiliated with the New Mexico Museum of History published a report contesting parts of the evidence. According to them, the photo showed inconsistencies in perspective and lighting that suggested editing or manipulation, even if done in the 19th century itself. The hypothesis was bold. The image could have been a kind of handcrafted collage, something possible with the rudimentary techniques of the time. This would explain, they said, why the faces appeared sharper than the rest of the landscape. The controversy grew. Independent experts countered, stating that differences in focus and light were common in tinplate photos taken under irregular conditions. At that time, camera lenses had natural distortions, and any slight movement during the capture could cause small variations. None of this, however, diminished the public's fascination. The photograph had become a kind of modern relic, not just because of Billy's figure, but because of the feeling of standing before a living piece of history. While experts debated technique and authenticity, another group began to focus on the symbolic meaning of the image. Croquet, a typically Victorian game, represented elegance, control, and civilization. Everything the Wild West seemed to deny. Billy's presence in such a game felt almost like an involuntary metaphor. There was the outlaw, the symbol of disorder, taking part in a ritual of calm and harmony. Some scholars saw in this an unconscious message about Billy's own fate, a man torn between two worlds, trying to find an impossible balance. Researchers of American popular culture began to reinterpret the myth under this new light. If Billy the Kid had once been seen as a tragic gunslinger, he was now being analyzed as a young man in search of identity. The photograph reinforced the idea that he wasn't a criminal by nature, but a product of a brutal time, where justice and revenge walked hand in hand. Every detail in the image, from the tilted hat to the calm gaze, began to be studied as a symbol. The very act of playing croquet, so out of context, came to be seen as resistance, a refusal to be only the character the world expected. Meanwhile, old stories resurfaced. Some residents of Fort Sumner claimed to have heard tales of a portrait of Billy kept by a local family. They said that after his death, Billy's personal belongings and mementos were distributed among close friends. One of those families, according to oral tradition, had kept the photo as a reminder of a time when everyone still believed he would escape death. Although no concrete evidence ever emerged, these oral memories further fueled the myth. At the same time, heritage archaeologists of the Old West launched expeditions to locate the remains of Boater and Tunstall's original ranches, trying to find physical clues about the photo's setting. Fragments of wood, old tools, and even twisted iron pieces, possibly croquet hoops, were found in excavations. None were definitive proof, but the accumulation of small coincidences formed an intriguing mosaic. The photograph seemed to take shape, expanding beyond the image and seeping into the landscapes of the present. What makes it all more fascinating is how this story resonated with the people of New Mexico. In small towns like Lincoln, Fort Sumner, and Silver City, historical tourism began to rise again. Local guides started including the CROQUET mystery in their storytelling, leading visitors to old sites where Billy and his companions supposedly passed. For many locals, the photo is more than a relic. It's a reminder that the West still holds secrets. But the line between myth and history remained thin. The image's growing popularity also drew fame seekers, and new photographs began to appear in auctions, all claiming to show Billy at different moments. Most were debunked, but the phenomenon revealed something important: the collective desire to see the man behind the legend. People didn't just want the gunslinger, they wanted the human being. The young man smiling in a field, holding a croquet mallet, and seeming for a moment to forget he was being hunted. The photo's allure also reached descendants of the families involved in the Lincoln County War. Some spoke out in interviews, saying they believed their ancestors truly took part in that gathering. Others, more cautious, chose silence, perhaps fearing to fuel the myth even further. Still, every statement, every memory passed down through generations, added new layers to the story. The croquet portrait ceased to be a simple object and became a mirror, reflecting not just Billy's past, but how Americans deal with their own frontiers, both real and imagined. In 2019, a new high-resolution digital scan was conducted. Photogrammetry technology revealed details almost invisible to the naked eye: the stitching pattern on Billy's coat, the type of fabric used in his shirt, and even the lawn's texture, consistent with the vegetation of the American Southwest. A period clothing expert confirmed that the outfit was typical of local farmers, and that the women's clothing in the background matched exactly the period between 1878 and 1880. No detail was out of place. These new pieces of evidence further reinforced the veracity of the record, but they also sparked another debate. If the photo really showed Billy, who took it? The most frequently mentioned name is Dan Dedrick, one of the regulators and cousin of Charlie Boder. Dedrick owned a rudimentary camera, and there are records that he enjoyed photography. He is said to have brought the equipment to the ranch on one of his visits and captured the scene by chance. The hypothesis is plausible since Dedrick survived the events of Lincoln and lived until the early 20th century, enough time for the photograph to be lost within his family inheritance. This possibility opens up a new line of reflection. If the record came from one of the regulators themselves, perhaps it had no symbolic value at the time. It was just a portrait of friends, and that's precisely why it survived, because it posed no danger and didn't need to be hidden. Time, with its usual irony, transformed that banal moment into one of the most debated images in American history. As the discussion deepened, screenwriters and producers began to see in the story of the photograph a new path to revisit Billy the Kid. Films and series started planning adaptations inspired by this unusual moment: the outlaw in a croquet game, an unexpected pause in the race for survival. The image, once confined to a private collection, had become a symbol of a new approach to the myth: less the man of guns, more the man whose soul was divided between freedom and fate. What's most curious is that the more science tried to explain the photo, the more it seemed to escape definition. Even with data, analysis, and comparisons, there was something about it that defied logic. Perhaps it was Billy's gaze, that same look which, in his only confirmed image, seemed to stare into the future with a mixture of defiance and serenity. In the croquet photograph, that gaze reappears, but in a different way: calm, distant, almost melancholic, a look that seems to know what's coming, and it is precisely that gaze that keeps the flame of mystery alive. Because among the dust of time and the shadows of the West, there is something in those eyes that continues to speak, not of guilt nor of glory, but of the fragility of someone who lived too fast to be understood. Over the years, the croquet photograph transcended the realm of history and entered the territory of collective memory, where myth and reality blur until they become indistinguishable. The face of Billy the Kid, once frozen in the hardness of a portrait from Fort Sumner, now gained another dimension. It was the same look, but in another time. Not that of the cornered outlaw, but of a young man on the edge of lost youth. The image began to be studied not just as a historical document, but as a cultural symbol. a window into the spirit of an era when the American frontier still pulsed with promises and tragedies. In universities and specialized forums, the debate over the photo began to expand. Visual culture historians emphasized how the image shifted the public perception of Billy. The myth, once shaped by sensationalist newspapers and adventure novels, was now undergoing reinterpretation. The boy who laughed with friends during a croquet game no longer fit the image of a cold-blooded killer. He represented the man in transition, caught between the wild Old West and the civilized New West. This symbolic reading made the photograph something much greater than its own authenticity. Even if it were someday proven false, the meaning it carried had already surpassed the limits of reality. The image also reignited interest in other forgotten figures who orbited Billy. Charlie Boder, Tom O'Folliard, the Coe brothers, and the mysterious Dan Dedrick were rediscovered. Letters, diaries, and testimonies once neglected were revisited in search of connections to the croquet episode. In one such manuscript, dated 1879, a former acquaintance of the regulators described an afternoon of games and laughter in a wooden-fenced field. No names are mentioned, but the tone is familiar. This description, previously ignored, gained new weight, showing that even in the darkest days of the Lincoln War, there was room for moments of lightness. In New Mexico, the local population began to treat the photograph as a living part of their heritage. Traveling exhibitions toured small towns, displaying enlarged copies of the image. Children learned in school about Billy the Kid, not only as a gunslinger, but as a historical character who reflected the contradictory spirit of the frontier. In Fort Sumner, the same town where he was killed, a gallery dedicated to the photo was inaugurated. Visitors from across the United States came to see the enlarged reproduction of that frozen instant. Before it, the audience stood in silence, as if waiting for the young man in the hat to suddenly tilt his head and smile back. Time has transformed photography into something that goes beyond its materiality. It has become a mirror for the modern audience, which seeks in the figures of the Old West a reflection of their own restlessness. Billy the Kid came to symbolize not only rebellion, but the vulnerability of someone who lived between extremes. An orphaned boy, pushed by circumstances, who fought to survive in a world with no place for innocence. And in that small portrait, amid friends and an unlikely game, there is a humanity that defies all official narratives. The most recent study, conducted by forensic anthropology experts, precisely analyzed the body posture of the photo's central figure. The tilt of the shoulders, the position of the legs, and the way he holds the mallet match the estimated height and proportions of Billy. Nearly invisible details, such as the curvature of the fingers and the way he rests his weight on the left heel, reinforce the similarity with the Fort Sumner portrait. These data, although not conclusive, increase the likelihood of authenticity. But what surprises is that the more it is proven, the greater the mystery grows. The reason lies in the nature of myth. Myth survives not because it answers questions, but because it keeps them alive. The croquet photograph functions as a symbolic frontier where past and present meet. It is the last moment of peace before the storm that would end with Billy's death in 1881. If it truly is him, then the image holds a kind of omen, the serene gaze of someone who, unknowingly, is being eternalized at the threshold of his own end. Meanwhile, collector Randy Guijarro, the man who found the photo by chance, became an inseparable part of the narrative. His discovery, made on impulse at a pawn shop, echoes the very unpredictable luck of the Old West. He says that the moment he saw the image for the first time, he felt a strange connection, as if he recognized something familiar without knowing what it was. Over time, Guijarro began to be sought out by journalists, historians, and the curious, all trying to understand how a simple $2 find could challenge more than a century of history. The image has been displayed at conferences, in documentaries, and in museums, always accompanied by the same question: who really was Billy the Kid? That question, which has long intrigued the public, gains new colors in the face of the photograph, because there, in the serenity of that moment, there seems to be more truth than in all the stories of shootouts and escapes. The figure that emerges from the portrait is that of a young man who had not yet been swallowed by legend, the last glimpse of his humanity before the myth took over his name. The impact of this image also spread through the world of entertainment. Films and series began to portray Billy in a more introspective manner, closer to the man and less to the hero. The photograph served as both visual and emotional reference for a new generation of filmmakers interested in showing the quieter side of the Old West. The unlikely croquet game came to symbolize the fragility of the American dream, the contrast between the ideal of civilization and the raw reality of guns. In the academic field, the debate continued to grow. Anthropologists and sociologists analyzed how the myth of Billy connects to the human need to create tragic heroes. The photograph, in this context, was seen as a portal that reveals the collective desire to believe that even the worst may have had a moment of purity. The boy's serene gaze on the field became a metaphor for a country divided between nostalgia for the past and the search for redemption. Amidst all this movement, new information continued to emerge. A distant descendant of Dan Dedrick revealed having inherited a small collection of old objects, among them fragments of a broken frame and a piece of metal plate similar to those used in tintype photography. Initial analyses suggest they could be part of the same set from which the original photo was taken. Although it cannot be stated with certainty, the coincidence rekindled researchers' interest. With each discovery, the mystery seems to expand, not resolve. Because contrary to what many believe, the power of this image does not lie in its scientific proof, but in the way it makes us question what we call historical truth. The Old West, after all, was never just a geographic period. It was a state of mind, a moral frontier where the boundaries between right and wrong blurred with the dust of the roads. And Billy the Kid, more than anyone else, personified that uncertainty. Today, when one observes the enlarged photograph in an exhibition, it's impossible not to feel the weight of time. The young face, the sunlit field, the friends around, everything seems still and eternal. And yet, behind the serenity, there is something tragic. It's as if that moment held the echo of all that would come later. The ambushes, the betrayals, the bullet that would end the boy's life in Fort Sumner. But in that frozen second, none of it exists. There is only the silence of the field and the faint shadow of a smile. Perhaps that is what makes this photograph so powerful. It doesn't just prove Billy's existence, it proves he lived. That before the myth, there was a man. That before death, there was a moment of peace, so brief that time almost didn't notice. And it is this moment that continues to cross generations, surviving the dust of the roads and the forgetfulness of stories. The boy's gaze in the photo doesn't ask for understanding nor forgiveness. It simply exists, firm and silent, like the West itself, which never reveals all that it holds.